The war was over. The guns were silent, the rising sun flag lowered, and Japan's empire lay shattered. On a humid afternoon in late 1945, a group of Japanese women sat quietly inside a makeshift camp once used as a U.S. airfield staging area in the Pacific. They were nurses, clerks, communications auxiliaries, survivors of a war they had been taught would never end in surrender. They had already experienced the unthinkable, capture by American forces. For months, they had lived behind barbed wire, guarded by soldiers they had once imagined as monsters. Then came the moment no one expected. An American commander, standing before them with an interpreter at his side, announced, "You are free to go." The women stared in silence. Some blinked rapidly, as if they had misheard. Others lowered their eyes, waiting for the cruelty hidden behind the words. Freedom, they thought, could not possibly be real. The officer repeated himself. They were free. They could return to their villages, to whatever homes had survived the bombings, to families they had not seen in years. Transportation would be arranged. And then, slowly, voices rose from among the women. Not cries of joy, not thanks, not even relief, but a plea that left the Americans speechless. "Please, let us stay." Who were these women? To understand the weight of this moment, we must know who these women were. By 1943, Japan's desperate need for manpower had drawn women into military service on a scale never seen before in the empire's history. They served as nurses in field hospitals, clerks in administrative units, telephone operators, typists, and logistical aides. Many were members of the Teishintai, volunteer corps drafted from schools and universities to support the war effort. Others were trained through the Army Nurse Corps or civilian auxiliaries attached to military garrisons. Most were in their late teens or 20s. They had grown up under militarist education, taught that loyalty to the emperor outweighed everything, even life itself. They had cheered the early victories in Manchuria and the Pacific, only to face years later the devastating reversals at Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. By the war's final year, these women were deployed on forward islands where battles raged with savage ferocity. Some tended to the wounded in caves lit by candles. Others typed reports in bunkers shaking from bombardments. Many were trapped when Japanese commanders ordered suicide charges rather than surrender. Against all odds, they survived. And survival meant something they had been told was worse than death: capture by the Americans. The poison of propaganda. From the day Japan went to war with the United States, a steady drumbeat of propaganda shaped how civilians and auxiliaries saw their enemy. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and military instructors hammered the same message. Americans were barbaric. They would rape, enslave, or murder Japanese women. Soldiers were described as beasts with white faces, racially impure degenerates who lacked honor. Female auxiliaries were given chilling instructions. If capture was imminent, they were to use grenades, poison, or knives to kill themselves. Some were told to take their patients or comrades with them in mutual death rather than surrender. The slogan repeated endlessly was, "Better death than disgrace." On Saipan in 1944, thousands of civilians, including women and children, leapt from cliffs into the sea, convinced that capture meant unspeakable torture. Propaganda films showed heroic mothers sacrificing themselves and their infants to avoid American hands. Teachers drilled schoolgirls to thrust bamboo spears at imaginary Marines, warning that if the enemy came, suicide was the only path of honor. For the women who eventually found themselves in U.S. captivity, the shock was not only personal, it was ideological. Everything they had been told about the enemy was about to collapse. The first encounter, most of the women captured in 1945 were emaciated, dehydrated, and terrified. Many had hidden in caves for days, surviving on handfuls of rice or muddy water. When American patrols found them, they flinched, expecting beatings or execution. Instead, they were searched, given canteens of water, and escorted to holding areas. A few collapsed from exhaustion the moment they realized they would not be killed. Then came the first unforgettable moment: food. Mess kits were handed out with rice, vegetables, sometimes even meat or bread. To stomachs long accustomed to scraps, the food was overwhelming. One nurse later admitted she cried as she chewed her first piece of bread in captivity. Another described how an American soldier gave her a chocolate bar. She held it for days before daring to eat it, certain it was some trick. When she finally tasted it, the sweetness nearly made her faint. Day after day, the reality deepened. Guards stood watch but did not assault them. Medics treated wounds with sulfur powder and bandages. When women fell ill, they were taken to camp infirmaries and given penicillin or quinine, drugs that were almost mythical back in Japan, where shortages had turned treatable infections into death sentences. The Americans did not mock their fear. Many soldiers, themselves weary from years of fighting, treated the women with a detached professionalism. Some even offered cigarettes or soap. The devils of propaganda looked instead like ordinary young men. The weight of relief. Relief did not come instantly. The first nights in captivity were sleepless. Women lay awake, waiting for the door of the barracks to open, for the violence they had been taught to expect. But the nights remained quiet. The guards paced outside but did not enter. No screams came from neighboring tents. Gradually, exhaustion overcame fear. Some women slept soundly for the first time in months. Hunger ebbed as meals became regular. Soap and clean water returned a sense of dignity. A nurse later remembered the astonishment of her first hot shower in captivity. "I stood under the water and wept. I had believed I would be killed. Instead, I was cleaner than I had been in years." The dissonance gnawed at them. If the enemy was kind, then who had lied? Their officers? Their emperor? The propaganda that urged them to die rather than face this reality? Life inside the camps. By autumn 1945, Allied policy called for humane treatment of all POWs under the Geneva Convention. Women were housed separately from men, given blankets, clothing, and space for cooking or recreation. Some were assigned light duties, cleaning, sewing, even helping in camp hospitals. Others were encouraged to rest and recover from malnutrition. The rations astonished them. Rice portions were larger than what they had eaten in months back home. Meat appeared regularly. Powdered milk, canned fruit, even sugar showed up in the mess halls. To American soldiers, it was simply logistics, supplies arriving by the shipload from the United States. To Japanese women, it was an alternate universe. One recalled writing in her diary, "I eat as a prisoner what my family could not dream of in freedom." Medical treatment deepened the shock. Tuberculosis patients were given streptomycin. Malaria cases received quinine. In Japan, such drugs were reserved for high officers or simply unavailable. Here, they were given even to women who had been enemies weeks before. The stigma of going home. Then came the announcement. The war was over and prisoners would be released. To American commanders, this was natural. The women had been enemy combatants, but the conflict was finished. Returning them home was the humane, logical step. But the women's reactions revealed a terrible truth. Freedom was not safety. Back home, Japan was in ruins. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya lay in ashes. Food was scarce. Families survived on rations of little more than sweet potatoes or grass. Diseases swept through urban rubble. Worse still was the social stigma. In a culture that equated capture with dishonor, returning as a POW, especially as a woman, carried unbearable shame. Families might disown them. Communities might treat them as tainted, dishonored, or even complicit in enemy propaganda. Some women whispered fears that they might be assaulted not by Americans, but by their own countrymen upon return, punished for the disgrace of having lived when so many had chosen death. Others feared starvation in ruined cities, or the violence of desperate civilians. Inside the American camps, for all their humiliation, they had shelter, food, medicine, and above all, safety. The plea, so when the commanders announced, "You are free to go," the women hesitated. Silence filled the camp yard. Some lowered their eyes, others began to cry softly. Then one spoke aloud. "Please, let us stay." Her voice was followed by another, and then another. Soon dozens were begging, hands clasped, heads bowed. They pleaded with their guards not to send them back, not to release them into a world of hunger, shame, and uncertainty. The Americans were stunned. Never in their lives had they seen prisoners refuse freedom. To the Japanese women, captivity had become sanctuary. That moment, when women raised on the creed of death before capture, chose captivity over freedom, marked one of the most extraordinary reversals of World War II. They had been taught that surrender was dishonor, that the Americans were monsters. Yet when faced with the choice between release and continued captivity, they begged to remain behind barbed wire. Their plea, "Please, let us stay," revealed not only the collapse of propaganda, but the desperation of a homeland in ruins and the unexpected humanity of their captors. The American officer could not quite believe what he had heard. He had just told the Japanese female prisoners that they were free to go, that transportation would be arranged to return them to their homeland. And yet instead of cheering or rushing for the gates, the women lowered their heads, gripped one another's hands, and begged in broken voices, "Please, let us stay." For the soldiers who had fought through the Pacific, it was one of the strangest reversals they had ever witnessed. But for the women themselves, the plea was rooted in fear, hunger, shame, and the collapse of an entire worldview. Their captivity had not been the nightmare they were promised. It had become, instead, the only place where survival seemed possible. Life behind barbed wire. Day by day, the camps settled into routine. At sunrise, guards rotated at the watchtowers while kitchen staff prepared breakfast. The women emerged from their barracks, some still cautious, others adjusting quickly to the rhythm of captivity. Breakfast alone was a revelation. Powdered eggs scrambled in large pans, bowls of rice, even bread with butter appeared. Hot coffee and sometimes milk were poured into tin cups. To American soldiers, it was simply mess hall fare. To the women, it was a banquet compared to the acorn-based substitutes and thin rice gruel that had sustained them during the final months of war. Lunches featured stews with chunks of pork or beef, potatoes, carrots, and cabbage, ingredients many had not tasted in years. Dinner might bring fish, beans, and tinned fruit. The abundance was shocking. Some women wept silently as they chewed, ashamed to feel gratitude toward those they had been told were demons. Even the leftovers amazed them. To see food scraped into bins, discarded casually, felt like a sin against the memory of starvation in Japan. More than one prisoner whispered, "They throw away what our families would kill to taste." The miracle of medicine, food was not the only shock. The medical care seemed miraculous. In Japan, shortages had reduced hospitals to shadows. Gauze was reused, penicillin almost non-existent, and common illnesses became death sentences. Nurses recalled tending soldiers dying of infections they could not treat. Tuberculosis spread unchecked. Malaria left survivors weak for months. In the American camps, however, medicine flowed. Penicillin injections cleared infections that had lingered for weeks. Quinine tablets halted malaria. Sulfur drugs treated wounds. Dentists filled cavities and pulled abscessed teeth. One nurse later confessed in a memoir, "I entered camp coughing blood, certain I would die within months. An American medic gave me pills I had never seen. Within weeks, the fever broke. I was healthier as their prisoner than I had been as a nurse for my own army." The realization was humiliating and liberating all at once. Their captors, once feared as barbarians, preserved their lives with resources Japan could no longer provide. The psychological collapse. Every meal, every clean bandage, every uneventful night eroded the propaganda they had carried like armor. They had been told Americans would assault them. Yet the guards treated them with distant respect, never crossing the lines of discipline. They had been told America was collapsing, that its soldiers were weak, undisciplined, starving. Yet these same soldiers handed out food in quantities that made the women dizzy. Some could not accept the contradiction. One clerk insisted for weeks that it must be a deception, a trap to break their spirits. But with each passing day, the trap never came. The food remained, the guards remained calm, and the medicine continued to work. Whispers spread through the barracks. Our officers lied. For women raised on the idea that loyalty to the emperor was sacred, the thought felt like betrayal. Yet the evidence was in their bodies. Weight returned to their cheeks. Wounds healed. Hair grew thick again. They could not deny what they saw in the mirror. Fear of returning home. And then came the order that they were free to go. To American commanders, this was an act of decency. To the women, it was a sentence of uncertainty. Japan in 1945 was a land of ashes. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, cities had been firebombed to rubble. Families lived in makeshift shacks, surviving on rations of sweet potatoes and watery soup. Hunger stalked the ruins, and black markets flourished with violence. But even worse than hunger was shame. In Japanese culture, capture was dishonor. Men who surrendered were often shunned. Women who returned as prisoners risked even harsher judgment. Families might reject them. Neighbors might whisper that they had been violated, regardless of truth. Some feared being attacked or driven to suicide by their own communities. One nurse whispered to her bunkmate, "To go home is to be less than human. Here, at least, we are fed." Inside the camps, they had shelter, safety, and dignity that their homeland could no longer promise. Beyond the wire, there was only ruin. Testimonies of the captives. Though many of the women remained silent after the war, fragments of testimony survived in diaries and oral histories. Aya, a 22-year-old nurse from Okinawa, wrote, "I begged the Americans not to send me home. My brothers were dead, my mother starved. Here I had rice and medicine. In freedom, I had nothing but shame." Keiko, a typist captured in the Philippines, remembered, "Every night I waited for them to come to our tents. They never did. They gave us blankets, cigarettes, even soap. The word prisoner meant life. The word freedom meant hunger." Michiko, a telefa, one operator, confessed decades later, "I gained weight as a prisoner. I laughed again as a prisoner. When they said we could leave, I thought of the ruins of my city, and I thought of the rice I ate every night. My choice was simple." Americans' disbelief. For the Americans, the pleas were baffling. Many soldiers had assumed prisoners longed for home. Instead, they saw rows of women bowing, begging to remain in barbed wire camps. One sergeant wrote to his wife, "Can you imagine? We told them they could go home and they begged to stay. They say there is nothing for them back there. It makes me wonder what their country has become if captivity is better than freedom." Officers debated how to respond. Some argued the women had to be repatriated regardless of their wishes. Others sympathized, noting that Japan's collapse had left civilians in conditions worse than those of prisoners. Captivity as sanctuary. Ultimately, many women were held longer than planned, partly because of logistical delays in shipping, and partly because Americans realized the women genuinely feared release. The camps became sanctuaries, strange, inverted havens where former enemies found stability. Routine grew familiar. Work assignments gave structure. Some women learned English from guards or taught Japanese phrases in return. A few even wrote letters home under censorship, though many hesitated, afraid their families would despise them for surrendering. The paradox deepened. The women were prisoners, yet for the first time in years they felt safe. The long shadow of shame. When repatriation finally came, it was not triumph. Women boarded ships with dread. Some tried again to plead with American officers. Others resigned themselves, clutching blankets or soap as talismans of their time in captivity. Back in Japan, many faced exactly what they feared. Families received them coldly. Communities whispered. The stigma of being a POW weighed heavily. Some concealed their experiences for decades. Others never married, believing themselves marked by dishonor. The long shadow of shame. When repatriation finally came, it was not triumph. Women boarded ships with dread. Some tried again to plead with American officers. Others resigned themselves, clutching blankets or soap as talismans of their time in captivity. Back in Japan, many faced exactly what they feared. Families received them coldly. Communities whispered. The stigma of being a POW weighed heavily. Some concealed their experiences for decades. Others never married, believing themselves marked by dishonor. Yet privately, many admitted a truth they could not speak aloud. They had lived better in American camps than in the ruins of Japan. The historical silence, unlike German POWs whose stories filled memoirs and archives, Japanese female POWs remained nearly invisible in history. Their shame silenced them. The narrative of patriotic sacrifice left no room for women who had chosen survival. But their plea, "Please let us stay," endured as a haunting reminder. It revealed the cruelty of a system that valued death over life and the strange mercy found in the hands of the enemy. The story of Japanese female POWs is not about heroism in battle or victory on the field. It is about human survival at its rawest. Women indoctrinated to die discovered instead that their enemy preserved them. When told they were free, they begged to remain behind wire. Freedom to them meant starvation, shame, and ruin. Captivity meant food, medicine, and safety. Their words still echo, "Please, let us stay." In those words lies the collapse of propaganda, the desperation of a defeated nation, and the quiet testimony that sometimes survival requires choosing the unthinkable.